The saloon was a powder keg of smoke and Saturday laughter, just waiting for a spark. Jedediah Carter sat right in the middle of it, a stone in a rushing river, and the river was trying its best to move him. He was a man carved from silence and sun, his hands a roadmap of barbed wire and branding iron scars. He hadn't come for the whiskey or the cards. He hadn't come for anything at all, and a bored, drunk crowd hates a quiet man more than anything. They needled him. They slapped his back. They dared him to prove he was alive. "Carter," a ranch hand slurred, his words thick with cheap liquor. "You sit there like a damn tombstone. If you ain't got a pulse, how about we find you one? Let's get you a bride, right here, right now." The room exploded in a roar of mean-spirited laughter. They loved the idea. A joke at someone else's expense was the best kind of entertainment. Jed's jaw tightened, but he didn't move. His stillness was like fuel on their fire. They hollered for a girl. Any girl. The joke took on a life of its own, stomping and kicking its way through the smoky air until the whole saloon was shaking with it. And that's when the door creaked open. A gust of night wind blew in, carrying dust and the cold light of the stars. In the doorway stood Martha Bell. She wasn't the kind of woman a saloon crowd cheers for. Her dress was patched, her shoulders were broad, and her face was etched with the kind of weariness that comes from tilling hard earth. She wasn't young. She wasn't delicate, and she wasn't alone. Clinging to her hand was a little girl, maybe 7 years old, with eyes far too big and solemn for a place like this. The laughter in the room faltered for a half-second when they saw the child. Then it came back, louder and harder, to cover up the sudden crack of shame. A man spat a stream of tobacco juice. "Well, Carter," he drawled, his voice slick with cruelty. "Looks like your bride comes with a dowry already." The saloon erupted again. The piano player hit a clanging, ugly chord, as if the instrument itself was disgusted. Martha Bell didn't flinch. She just held her daughter's hand tighter, her chin held high, even as a flush of color crept up her neck. She knew this kind of mockery. It was a language she understood all too well. She walked forward, not because she wanted to, but because her pride wouldn't let her run. Each step was like wading through a swamp of whispers and leers. Jed's gaze, which had been fixed on nothing, finally found something to land on. He saw her. Not the joke the crowd wanted her to be, but the woman who was walking through a storm of judgment with her spine straight and her hand wrapped fiercely around her child's. He saw the exhaustion in her eyes, but beneath it, he saw something that hadn't broken. The men were pounding the tables now, chanting his name. "Ask her proper, Carter. Ask her proper." It was the punchline, the final humiliating blow. Jed could have laughed it off. He could have turned his back and walked out, but something in the room had shifted. A strange, heavy silence was pressing in at the edges of the noise. The child's eyes, wide and scared, darted from one sneering face to the next, finally landing on Jed. Her tiny fingers curled tighter around her mother's hand, bracing for the hit she knew was coming. A knot tightened in Jed's chest. He'd faced down blizzards and droughts, but he'd never seen courage look so small and so mighty all at once. So he rose. The laughter died in their throats. His boots sounded like hammers on the floorboards as he crossed the room. He stopped right in front of Martha Bell. He looked at her weary face, her tight jaw, her shoulders braced for the insult. And then he bent his knee. A collective gasp sucked the air out of the saloon. The joke had suddenly stopped being funny. Jed's voice was low, but it cut through the silence like a razor. "Miss Bell," he said, his eyes locked on hers. "This town has had its fun at your expense. Maybe I was a fool for lettin' 'em, but I'd rather make a fool of myself than see you stand alone in this." He took a breath. "What do you say we make this real?" The entire town, packed into one smoky room, held its breath. The joke was over, and something far more dangerous and far more real was just beginning. Morning came, and the town awoke with a new favorite story to tell. What started as a drunken jest in a saloon had become hard fact by sunrise. Jedediah Carter, the quietest man in the county, had taken a saloon bride. The gossip spread faster than a prairie fire, whispered over porch railings and general store counters. kids in the street made up a cruel little rhyme, chanting it as Martha walked by to fetch water, her daughter hiding behind her skirts. "Plain bride from the saloon, Carter's ranch will fall by noon." The words were like stones, and though Martha kept her head high, the metal bucket trembled in her hand. Jed rode into town for supplies and was met with a wall of smirks. Men who used to nod at him now tipped their hats in a mocking parody of respect. "Careful, Carter," one called out, spitting a brown stream of tobacco near his boots. "A wife like that'll eat through your winter stores before the first snow." The laughter that followed was sharp and ugly. Jed's jaw was a line of granite, but he didn't say a word. Silence had always been his shield, but now it felt thin as paper. Inside the mercantile, Martha overheard two of the town's most pious women whispering behind a stack of flour sacks. "Poor man," one said, her voice dripping with fake pity. "He could have had any respectable girl, ends up with a worn-out widow and her baggage." The other woman snickered. "She'll be an anchor round his neck, mark my words." Martha's cheeks burned, but she paid for her flour, her back ramrod straight, and walked out without giving them the satisfaction of a single tear. Back at the ranch, the few hands Jed had left were just as bad. They ate the food she cooked with sullen, resentful silence. Finally, one of them, a young hand named Billy, got bold. "Boss," he said, pushing his plate away, "you married her for a laugh. We all saw it. You ain't really keepin' her, are you?" Jed slammed his own plate down on the table. The clatter echoed in the sudden quiet. His voice, when it came, was low and dangerous, like the rumble of distant thunder. "She's the first person in 5 years," he said, his eyes sweeping over the stunned faces of his men, "who's made this place feel like a home." The words hung in the air, startling Martha most of all. She hadn't expected a defense. She hadn't expected anything. That night she knelt by her daughter's bed, praying in a whisper so soft Jed couldn't hear. "Lord," she murmured, "don't let me be a burden. Let me be a help." Her daughter, Lily, stirred in her sleep and pressed a small, warm hand against Martha's cheek. For the sake of that small touch, Martha found the strength to stand up. Later, Jed was out in the pasture, fighting with the wild mare he'd been trying to break for months. The horse was a storm of panicked muscle, rearing and shying away from him. But then Lily, who had slipped out of the cabin, walked right up to the corral fence. She stretched her small hand through the rails. Jed's heart leaped into his throat. "Girl, get back!" he yelled. But the wild mare, slick with sweat and fear, suddenly went still. She lowered her massive head and gently nudged the child's palm with her velvet nose. Jed stared, a feeling he couldn't name stirring in his chest. A quiet child and a wild horse. It didn't make sense. It was the first sign that the woman and child he'd brought to his ranch were not what they seemed. Sunday morning, the church bells rang out like a judgment. They walked into town together, a silent man and a plain woman, and the congregation parted for them like they were carrying a plague. The pews around them remained empty. The preacher climbed to his pulpit and aimed his sermon right at them. "Be not unevenly yoked in mockery," he thundered, his eyes finding theirs. "For the Lord does not bless a union founded on a drunken jest." Every word was a lash. Martha's knuckles went white where she gripped her daughter's hand, and then she felt something rough and calloused cover her own. It was Jed's hand. He didn't look at her. He just held on, a silent act of defiance that was louder than any sermon. But as they left the church, walking through a gauntlet of hostile stares, one of the ranch hands who had quit cornered Jed by the wagon. It was Billy. His face was pale. "Boss," he whispered, looking nervously over his shoulder. "You need to be careful. You don't know who you brought into your house. She ain't who she says she is." Before Jed could demand an explanation, Billy scurried away, melting back into the disapproving crowd. Jed helped Martha onto the wagon seat, his mind reeling. He looked at her, really looked at her, searching for some sign, some hint of deception. But all he saw was the same weary strength that had drawn him to her in the first place. The ride home was long and silent, the wind carrying the town's whispers behind them. That night, Jed didn't sleep. He sat in a chair by the dying fire, his rifle across his lap, watching the two strangers who now shared his home. The joke had become a marriage. The marriage had become a war with the town. And now, a former ranch hand's cryptic warning had turned his home into a place of suspicion. Who was Martha Bell? And what trouble had he just invited over his threshold? Winter came down on the plains like a fist, burying the world in snow and silence. Inside the small cabin, a different kind of silence had taken root, one thick with unspoken questions. Jed rose in the dark each morning, the quiet rhythm of his life now punctuated by the soft breathing of two other people. Martha was always up before him, coaxing the embers in the hearth back to life. She moved with a purpose that seemed designed to prove her worth, chopping wood, mending his worn shirts, her hands never idle. But they barely spoke. Their eyes would meet across the simple wooden table, and 100 questions would hang in the air between them, none of them ever asked. He was a man drowning in suspicion, and she was a woman clinging to a secret. Jed couldn't shake Billy's warning. He started watching her. He noticed things he hadn't before. She had a small, carved wooden box she kept tucked away, and he never saw her open it. Sometimes he'd catch her staring out the window at the endless, snow-covered prairie, her expression not just lonely, but watchful, as if she were expecting someone to come riding out of the white emptiness. One night, he couldn't stand it anymore. He found her mending one of Lily's dresses by the firelight. "Martha," he said, his voice rough, "where did you and the girl come from before you came to town?" She didn't look up from her sewing. Her hands kept moving, steady as a clock. "From a place that's best left in the past, Jedediah." The answer was no answer at all, and it only coiled the suspicion tighter in his gut. The child, Lily, was another mystery. She was quiet, too quiet for a girl her age. She spent hours by herself, drawing strange patterns in the frost on the windowpane. One afternoon Jed saw what she was drawing. It was a house, and there were flames coming from the windows. Over and over again, she drew the same picture, a burning house. "What's that you're drawing, little one?" he asked gently. She looked up at him with those big, solemn eyes and whispered a single chilling phrase. "The old home." A cold dread trickled down Jed's spine. This wasn't just a child's fantasy, it was a memory. The pressure kept building. One blizzard-swept afternoon, there was a knock at the door. It was the preacher, his face grim, his Bible clutched in his hand. He wasn't there to sermonize. He seemed almost desperate. He pulled Jed outside into the swirling snow, out of earshot of Martha. "Son," he said, his voice low and urgent, "I'm warning you as a man of God. You need to send that woman away. I know you think you're doing a noble thing, but you are courting a danger you cannot possibly understand." Jed's anger flared. "What danger? Tell me what you know." The preacher just shook his head, his face a mask of conflict. "I cannot break a confidence, but trust me, Jedediah, some sorrows are meant to be borne alone. Send her away before her past finds her, because when it does, it will burn down everything you have." With that, he turned and trudged back through the snow, leaving Jed standing there with 100 more questions and a growing sense of fear. The next week, the thaw came. The snow melted, revealing the dead brown earth. Jed was out on the far edge of his property, checking a section of fence that bordered the wild, unclaimed lands to the west. The ground was soft and muddy. As he worked, his boot heel sank into a patch of earth that felt wrong. It was too loose. He knelt down, his heart starting to pound. He scraped away the mud and the wet leaves with his bare hands, and he found it. It was the clear outline of a rectangle, about 6 feet long and 3 feet wide. The earth had been disturbed, and recently. It was a grave. A freshly dug, empty grave. Someone had come out here to his land, dug a grave, and then left. Jed stood up, his breath misting in the cold air. The preacher's warning echoed in his mind. Her past will find her. He looked back toward the small cabin, where a thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. The grave wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Someone was coming, and they were planning on leaving someone buried on his land. The empty grave haunted Jed's days and stalked his nights. He didn't tell Martha. How could he? Every time he looked at her, he saw a dozen different women. The weary widow, the defiant survivor, the quiet stranger with a secret she would die to protect. He started sleeping with his Colt Peacemaker on the table beside his bed, a cold lump of steel that was the only thing that felt certain anymore. The ranch, already struggling, began to bleed out. More hands quit, tired of the town's scorn and the grim silence that had fallen over the place. The spring rains came, turning the fields to a sea of mud and isolating them completely. The cabin became a pressure cooker, the three of them trapped inside with the rising tension and the ghosts of their unspoken fears. Then, one rain-lashed afternoon, a rider appeared out of the gray mist. He wasn't from the town. He was a stranger, hard-faced and weathered, with eyes that had seen too much. He rode right up to the porch as if he owned the place, his hand resting casually on the butt of the gun strapped to his hip. "I'm looking for a woman," he said, not bothering with a greeting. His voice was like gravel. "Goes by the name of Martha Bell, her and a little girl." Jed's hand instinctively went to the axe handle leaning against the cabin wall. "Who's askin'?" The stranger gave a thin, humorless smile. "A business associate of her late husband." He let that hang in the air for a moment. "Only her name ain't Bell. It's Blackwood. Martha Blackwood, and her husband, Silas Blackwood, he wasn't no farmer. He was the leader of the meanest gang of outlaws this side of the Rockies." Jed felt the ground shift beneath his feet. The stranger's words hit him like physical blows. "And I'm what you might call a bounty hunter," the man continued, his smile widening. "See, Silas, he double-crossed his own men. Took the score from their last job, a bank in Colorado, 50,000 in gold coin, and vanished. They caught up to him, put him in the ground. But they never found the gold, and they figure his pretty little widow knows right where he stashed it." Suddenly, it all made a horrifying kind of sense. The town's fear, the whispers, the preacher's frantic warnings. It wasn't just social disapproval. They knew who she was, and they were terrified that the Blackwood gang would come tearing their town apart looking for her and the money. The preacher hadn't been trying to condemn Jed. He'd been trying to save him. The bounty hunter leaned forward in his saddle, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The rest of the gang, they'll be here in a few days. They ain't as patient as I am. They'll burn this place to the ground with all of you in it to get what they want." He straightened up, his eyes cold and flat. "So here's the deal, Carter. You turn the woman and the kid over to me. I get a piece of the bounty, the gang gets their gold, and you get to live." The rain hammered down on the tin roof of the porch, the only sound in the world. An ultimatum, her life for his. The bounty hunter stared at him, waiting for an answer. Jed slowly turned his head and looked through the window into the dim light of the cabin. He could see Martha humming softly to Lily, her face illuminated by the fire. The woman he'd married as a cruel joke. The woman who might be a liar, a thief's widow, the cause of his ruin. The woman who might get him killed. He turned back to the bounty hunter, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat, his choice hanging heavy as a tombstone in the suffocating air. The bounty hunter's offer echoed in the space between raindrops. "Turn her over. Save yourself." It was the sensible thing to do, the logical choice, but since when had any of this been logical? Jed looked from the cold, patient killer on the horse to the warm, fire-lit window of his home. He thought of Martha's quiet strength, of Lily's solemn eyes, of the way the wild mare gentled under the child's touch. He had stumbled into this life by accident, but it was his life now. He took a step forward, his boots sinking into the mud. "You get back on your horse," Jed said, his voice dangerously low. "And you ride off my land." The bounty hunter actually laughed, a short, ugly bark. "You're a bigger fool than they say you are, Carter. I'll be back, and I won't be alone." He wheeled his horse around and galloped off into the gray, rain-soaked landscape, a messenger of death sent to fetch an army. The moment he was gone, Jed walked back inside, the cold rain clinging to him. Martha looked up, her eyes wide with a fear she could no longer hide. She had heard it all. "It's true, isn't it?" Jed asked, his voice flat. There was no point in pretending anymore. She collapsed into a chair, the story pouring out of her in a torrent of whispered, desperate words. Her name was Martha Blackwood. Her husband, Silas, had been a good man once, before the war twisted him into something hard and greedy. The outlaw life had been a trap, one he was trying to escape. The last robbery, the 50,000 in gold, was supposed to be their way out. A new start, a new life, a new name. But his own men had turned on him. They'd murdered him in cold blood and burned their home to the ground, with her and Lily barely escaping into the night. Lily's drawings weren't just a memory, they were a recurring nightmare. "He hid the money before they killed him," Martha sobbed, her body shaking. "He said he'd leave me a sign, a map. But I never found it. I swear, Jedediah, I don't know where it is." She fumbled with the clasp of the small wooden box Jed had been so suspicious of. She opened it. Inside there was no gold, no jewels, just a few faded letters, a lock of a man's hair, and a small folded piece of paper. It was a map, a cryptic, hand-drawn map of a place she didn't recognize. Jed took the paper. The lines were faint, the landmarks strange. A lightning-scarred oak, a cluster of 3 standing stones, a creek that forked like a serpent's tongue. His blood ran cold. He knew this place. He knew every rock and every tree. It wasn't some random piece of land. It was a map of his own ranch. Silas Blackwood must have known this property intimately. He had buried a fortune somewhere on Jed's land. The danger wasn't just coming for them, they were living on top of it. A wave of fierce, protective anger washed over Jed, so strong it took his breath away. The town's scorn, the bounty hunter's threats, the secrets, none of it mattered anymore. This woman and her child were his. He had made a promise in that saloon, a promise born of a joke, but it had taken root in his soul and become the truest thing he had ever known. "Get the rifle," he said to Martha, his voice hard as iron. "Barricade the windows, they're coming back." As Martha scrambled to obey, her face a mixture of terror and a dawning fragile hope, Jed stepped back out onto the porch. He stared out at the horizon, at the storm clouds that were a perfect mirror of the violence that was about to break over their heads. He had chosen his side, and as he stood there watching and waiting, he heard a new sound above the drumming of the rain. It was the squelch of a single horse, approaching slowly, deliberately. Jed raised his rifle, his finger tightening on the trigger. A figure emerged from the mist. It wasn't the bounty hunter. It was the preacher, a heavy shotgun resting in the crook of his arm, his face set like a granite cliff. He rode right up to the porch and looked at Jed, his eyes filled with a weary sorrow. "I see you didn't take my advice, son," the preacher said, his voice heavy with resignation. "The Lord asks us to turn the other cheek, but the Blackwood gang will just cut it off." He swung down from his horse. "I tried to get her out of my town to save it, and I tried to get her off your ranch to save you. Since you're too damn stubborn to be saved, I suppose I'll just have to settle for helping you fight." Jed stared at him, stunned into silence. The preacher wasn't just a man of words, he was a man of action. "You knew Silas, didn't you?" Jed asked, the pieces finally clicking into place. The preacher nodded grimly. "I knew him when he was just a boy, a good boy. Before he went wrong, he worked this very ranch. For your father. He knew this land better than anyone." A new, shocking truth hit Jed. The treasure wasn't just on his land. It was hidden by a man who had walked this same earth, a man tied to his own family's past. The preacher looked past Jed, into the dark interior of the cabin. "God forgive me," he murmured, "for what is about to happen in this place." At that exact moment, from the ridge line to the west, they saw them. A dozen riders, dark silhouettes against the stormy sky, their rifles glinting in the dying light. The bounty hunter had kept his promise. The gang was here. The siege had begun. The world exploded in a chaos of gunfire and splintering wood. The Blackwood gang descended on the ranch like a pack of wolves, their howls and gunshots ripping through the rain-soaked air. Inside the cabin, Jed, the preacher, and Martha became a desperate 3-person army. The preacher, his face a grim mask of righteous fury, fired his shotgun from one window, the blasts echoing like hell's own thunder. Jed, calm and methodical, fired his rifle from another, making every shot count. But it was Martha who was the real surprise. She was not a cowering victim. She grabbed an old hunting rifle from the wall, her hands steady, her eyes blazing with a mother's protective fire. She fought beside them, a warrior defending her home and her child. The battle raged for what felt like an eternity. Bullets chewed through the cabin walls, kicking up splinters and dust. Lily huddled in the root cellar beneath the floorboards, her hands pressed over her ears. Above her, the three defenders fought with the grim knowledge that they were hopelessly outnumbered. "They're trying to flank us! The barn!" Jed yelled over the din. He and the preacher laid down covering fire while Martha raced to the back of the cabin, firing through a crack in the wall to drive back the outlaws creeping through the mud. During a brief, terrifying lull in the fighting, as the gang regrouped, Jed's eyes fell on the map, which lay on the table. The lightning-scarred oak, the 3 standing stones. He knew those landmarks. But the final clue had always stumped him, where the hearth fire warms the cold earth. It was a riddle. And suddenly, in the heart of the firefight, with death hammering at the door, the answer hit him with the force of a revelation. It wasn't about a landmark outside. It was about the cabin itself, the hearth, the very heart of their home. "The hearthstone!" he yelled, his voice raw. "The money's under the hearth!" But there was no time. A new wave of attacks began, more ferocious than the last. The front door splintered under the impact of a heavy log used as a battering ram. The leader of the gang, a hulking, bearded man with eyes as dead as a snake's, burst into the room. It was the man who had killed Silas. He saw Martha, and a cruel, triumphant grin spread across his face. "The widow!" he snarled, raising his pistol. "The gold! You're gonna tell me where it is." Before anyone could react, he lunged, grabbing Martha by the hair and pressing the cold barrel of his gun to her temple. The preacher raised his shotgun, but the outlaw just laughed. "Drop it, old man, or she dies now." Time seemed to slow down. The gunfight outside faded to a dull roar. Everything narrowed to the life-or-death struggle inside the cabin. Jed saw the terror in Martha's eyes, but also a flicker of defiance. The outlaw started to drag her toward the door. "We're leaving, Carter," he yelled. "The woman comes with me. You want her back? You bring me the gold." But he never made it. Jed had been moving, a shadow along the far wall. He launched himself across the room, tackling the outlaw with the force of a freight train. The 2 men crashed to the floor in a brutal tangle of limbs. The outlaw's pistol went flying. It was a savage, desperate fight, fists and knees and teeth. The outlaw was bigger, stronger, but Jed was fighting for more than gold. He was fighting for his home. He was fighting for her. The struggle was a blur of pain and desperation. The outlaw landed a heavy blow to Jed's side, and Jed felt a sharp, searing agony as a rib cracked. But he fought through the pain, fueled by pure adrenaline. He got his hands around the outlaw's throat, squeezing with all the strength he had left. The outlaw's face turned purple, his eyes bulging. Just as Jed felt his own strength failing, a heavy object came crashing down on the back of the outlaw's head. It was the preacher, wielding his shotgun like a club. The outlaw went limp. The siege wasn't over. The rest of the gang was still outside, but their leader was down. Jed staggered to his feet, gasping for breath, his side screaming in protest. He looked at Martha, her face pale but her eyes shining with a fierce, unwavering light. They had survived the worst. Now they just had to win the war. The fall of their leader broke the back of the Blackwood gang. Seeing him dragged from the cabin, unconscious and bleeding, the remaining outlaws lost their nerve. Their assault faltered, then dissolved into a panicked retreat. They scattered like quail into the pre-dawn gloom, leaving behind the scent of gunpowder and the wreckage of their attack. As the first pale light of morning broke over the horizon, a profound silence fell over the ranch, broken only by the drip of rain from the eaves and the ragged breathing of the 3 survivors. They were bruised, bloodied, and utterly exhausted, but they were alive. And they were victorious. The preacher, his face smudged with soot, offered a quiet prayer of thanks. Then, without another word, he helped Jed pry up the heavy, flat stone that formed the base of the hearth. Beneath it, tucked into a hollowed-out space in the cool earth, was a heavy, locked metal box. Using the butt of his rifle, Jed shattered the rusty lock. The lid creaked open. Inside, glowing in the soft morning light, was a fortune. Stacks of gold coins, bundles of crisp banknotes, $50,000, enough to buy 100 ranches like this one, enough to start a new life anywhere in the world. They stared at it, the three of them, the treasure that had caused so much death and destruction. It seemed small and insignificant now, just metal and paper. Later that day, a few men from the town rode out, led by the sheriff. They had seen the gunfire, heard the battle, and had finally mustered the courage to investigate. They saw the bullet-riddled cabin, the dead outlaws dotting the yard, and the grim, exhausted faces of Jed, Martha, and the preacher. The story came out, told in the preacher's stern, unwavering voice. He told them of Martha's past, of the gang's evil, and of the courage he had witnessed in that cabin. The town's mockery turned to shame, and their shame turned to a quiet, grudging respect. They had condemned a woman they should have protected and scorned a man who had more courage than all of them combined. In the days that followed, the ranch began to heal. Neighbors, once hostile, now showed up with hammers and lumber, offering to help rebuild. They brought food and offered quiet, awkward apologies. The cloud of shame that had hung over Jed and Martha had finally lifted. One evening, as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, Jed and Martha stood on the rebuilt porch. Lily was in the corral, her laughter ringing in the clean evening air as the once wild mare followed her like a puppy. The gold was still there, hidden away, but they hadn't touched it. They didn't need it. "Martha," Jed said, his voice soft. He took her hand, his calloused palm fitting perfectly against hers. He went down on one knee, right there on the porch, with no crowd and no jest. "I asked you once to make a fool of me. Now I'm asking you to make me the luckiest man alive. Will you be my wife? For real, this time." Tears streamed down Martha's face, but for the first time, they were tears of joy. "Jedediah Carter," she said, her voice thick with emotion, "I already am." They had found their treasure, and it had nothing to do with the gold buried beneath their floor. It was in the quiet moments, in the shared laughter, in the feeling of a small hand slipping into theirs. It was the hard-won piece of a home built not on a foundation of stone, but on a bedrock of courage, forgiveness, and a love that had been forged in the heart of a storm. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We love hearing from you. Thanks for stopping by.